What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and welcome to part 2 of our How to Play Warhammer 40,000s in 9th edition. Let's frickin' do it. In the first video, we talked about the base core mechanics of Warhammer 40k, how to set up your army and play through an entire turn. And in this video, I'm going to be going over some of the more special rules in the game that you will run into pretty commonly on the tabletop. There's going to be a lot of small minutiae that I'm not going to cover in this particular video. If that does come up in your games, you will be able to find a lot of the answers to those questions and exactly how very specific abilities and interactions work in the rare rules section of the Warhammer 40k rulebook or errata documents. That has a bunch of very particular interactions that are hyper specific and we won't be talking about today. But I'd like to start off with some more general stuff. First off, I had some questions in the comment section of the last video and things that people pointed out that I didn't cover, and I will be talking about those first. First off, some eagle-eyed viewers noticed that when I displayed the Swarmlord datasheet up on the screen, that he actually has 3 separate stat lines on his profile. This is a profile called a damage table, also known as a bracketing profile or degrading profile, and means that the model's statistics on the table can change as they lose wounds. If you notice, looking at the datasheet, there is a separate wounds characteristic for each of the brackets. When the Swarmlord reaches that number of remaining wounds after taking damage over the course of the game, the stats will change to represent whatever the current line looks like. In this case, he'll lose speed, strength, and attacks as he degrades, but some units can lose different qualities, and some even get better in some instances as they receive damage. In addition, I saw some questions about invulnerable saves versus armor saves. Invulnerable saves are just a save that can be taken in place of your normal armor save if you elect to. They aren't required to be taken if you have one, and they don't turn on if you don't have an armor save to take. So if you want to, sometimes you can elect to take your invulnerable saving throw in place of your armor saving throw, or vice versa, even if one of them is worse than the other. This can be used in some really particular situations if you actually want to take casualties. For example, to make an enemy unit's charge more difficult, or to remove their ability to target you later on in a shooting phase. This is usually pretty technical, and generally speaking, you want to keep your models alive, so you're going to take whichever save is better for you, but that's totally under that model's controlling player's control. Now, a couple other specific rules that I didn't touch on that pertained to some of the things we covered in the first video. During the psychic phase, I didn't talk about Perils of the Warp, which is a big downside to casting a lot of psychic powers during your psychic phase. We talked about psychic tests, the 2d6 roll that you're trying to compare to the warp charge value of your spell in order to see if the spell or psychic power goes off. Now, there's some dangers with using psychic powers, and these become apparent when you roll a double 1 or a double 6, in which case the caster of the psychic power suffers what is called Perils of the Warp. In this case, they take D3 mortal wounds, so D3 wounds are immediately going to be removed from their profile, and if they're killed by that Perils of the Warp, bad things happen. If they do die as a result of that, the power automatically fails. Even if you roll double 6s, which would normally almost automatically succeed, it's not going to go off. In addition, the caster explodes and hits everything within 6 inches for D3 mortal wounds as well. This is the biggest danger with using psychic powers, which means that you could be damaging your own troops while using them, in addition to their inherent inconsistency. Another characteristic that I didn't cover on because it wasn't really relevant in the tutorial turn that we played out was the blast characteristic of some weapons. Some weapons have this ability listed under their special rules, and what it does is make them more effective at targeting large numbers of enemy models. If a blast weapon with a variable number of attacks, for example, a D6 or D3 number of attacks, fires at a unit of 6 or more models, any rolls below a 3 for their number of attacks will be considered a 3. So they become minimum 3 shots if they attack those 6+ model units. If you attack an 11+ model unit, however, they automatically max out the number of shots. Basically, you're considered to have rolled a 6 for all of the dice that you're rolling in order to generate your number of attacks. The size of the unit is determined when you select them as the target, so even if your subsequent shooting from that same unit reduces that target unit below 11 or 6 models, you will still be getting the benefits of that blast as long as they had those numbers at the start of that model's shooting activation. In addition, if you have a multi-D6 roll for a single weapon, the blast ability applies to the total of your roll, not the roll for each individual die. So for example, if you are firing a 2d6 blast weapon at a unit of 6 models, each die wouldn't have a minimum of 3 shots, the total roll would have a minimum of 3 shots, which means it wouldn't really come into play unless you roll double ones on the characteristic for that blast. However, you get a big bonus if you attack an 11 plus model unit because you'd be getting 12 shots rather than just 6 for a 1d6 weapon, for example. The other downside of blast weapons is that even with the big guns never tire rule that we talked about in reference to monsters or vehicles, which allows them to fire in combat, sometimes at the penalty of -1 to hit if they're carrying a heavy weapon, blast weapons cannot be fired in combat. So if you're using the big guns never tire rule to shoot at models engaging you, it's usually good to declare that your blast weapons will target something out of melee in the off chance that you kill whatever's engaging you and are then free to make those attacks with your blast weapons. All right, moving on to some different advanced rules. Let's talk about one of the most important mechanics in Warhammer 40,000. This is command points and using stratagems. Command points are a persistent resource that players use over the course of the game, either to build their army list pregame and get themselves some bonuses, or to use special abilities called stratagems throughout the course of the game. The number of command points that you start the game with depends on the game size that you're playing. For a normal 2,000 point game, you'd start with 12 command points, and when you build your list, you'll spend those command points on detachments or pre-game stratagems. We talk about this a lot in the list building video. I'll go ahead and link that in the description for those who haven't taken a look at that. But we do have a tutorial on how to build a list, and that talks about the command point costs of various detachments. But generally, a detachment will bleed a couple of your command points when you include it. However, a single patrol or battalion detachment, if it has your warlord in it, will refund its own CP, meaning you can regenerate a couple CP in some instances while you're building your list. That means that most lists built off a single detachment will start a game of Warhammer 40,000 with 12 CP, at least a 2,000 point game. Before the game as well, you have the option to spend those command points on entering models into strategic reserve. I'll talk about that in the next section when we talk about the reinforcement step of the movement phase. But the other and probably most important thing that you spend CP on is using stratagems. Stratagems are special abilities you use over the course of a game with specific triggers. For example, a lot of stratagems can be used before the game starts, at the start of the first battle round, when a unit is selected to shoot, for example, are a lot of very common triggers. And you will spend CP from your command point pool in order to unlock that stratagem, which will then have an effect that affects the game state. Each codex in 40k gives you a certain number of stratagems that you may use throughout the game using that army. These are usually unlocked by having a full detachment of units coming out of that codex or with the correct faction keyword. But there are also some generic stratagems that everyone has access to. And I will discuss those here real quick because every army having access to them means that they are very integral to how 40k plays. The first one, and probably most common one, is command reroll. This allows you to reroll a single hit roll, wound roll, damage roll, saving throw, advance roll, charge roll, psychic test, or deny the witch test, or the dice that you roll for a number of attacks for a weapon. Now, importantly, when we're talking about hit rolls, wound rolls, damage rolls, or saving throws, rerolling a single one of those, because those are assumed to have happened sequentially, means that you are only rerolling a single dice out of that total pool of attacks. So, for example, if I were to attack with 5 Space Marines shooting 10 bolt gun shots and wanted to command point reroll one of them, I would only reroll one of the hit rolls, not all of the hit rolls out of that attack. Similarly, we talked about how saves and damage are applied sequentially if you're using the fast dice roll mechanics in the core book. This is the situation where rolling those out individually, if you're intending to use a command point reroll, is very important because you will only be able to reroll the test if you have rolled it in sequence. So, for example, if I'm taking 4 armor saves, I would roll them one at a time and decide immediately before my model takes damage after I roll any one of those rolls whether I'm going to reroll it. Basically, the same thing goes for damage rolls, which would be rerolled by the attacker immediately after the defender fails their saving throw. For charge roll psychic tests, deny the witch tests, and number of attacks for a weapon, if those roll 2d6, which charge rolls and psychic tests will typically do, when you use a command point reroll, you will reroll all of the dice in that roll. So you'll pick up both dice for your charge roll, for example, and reroll both of them. Advanced rolls, however, use a single d6, so you're just going to reroll the one of them. Command rerolls are probably the most common place that you're going to see command points be used, so it's important to know all of the mechanics associated with them. We also have a bunch of other stratagems we can use that are a little bit more niche. The first one is Cut Them Down, which you can use when an enemy falls back from you and allows you to deal them mortal wounds on rolls of 6. You roll 1d6 for each model in engagement range of the enemy unit. I'll just go out and say it right now, this stratagem is terrible and it very rarely gets used. It is something to keep in the back of your mind if you are in a situation where you really need to deal a mortal wound to somebody, but this isn't a tactics video. We'll give you some free tactics real quick here. Probably never use this stratagem. Desperate Breakout is a very important one, however. You use it when a unit moves in the movement phase that is in engagement range of an enemy unit. It allows them to fall back even through enemy models. So if the situation that came up in the previous video where a Space Marine was pinned in place by enemy models and couldn't fall back, you could use the Desperate Breakout stratagem to allow him to essentially climb over the models surrounding him. The downside is that you roll a d6 for each model in the unit, and on a roll of 1, that model is dead. If you then fall back and can't move the entire unit out of engagement range of any enemy models, any models that remain in engagement range are immediately destroyed. So this stratagem does cost 2 CP and comes with some significant dangers, but it allows you to extricate yourself. There is also a downside where even if you have an ability or stratagem that would normally allow you to fall back and act as normal, Desperate Breakout prevents you from doing that, full stop. We also have another very similar one, Emergency Disembarkation. This is used when a transport that's carrying models is destroyed, which we will talk about later in this video. It allows you to disembark those models within 6 inches of the transport's location rather than 3. This is very useful if you're wanting to put your models out of line of sight or dodge enemy engagement range with those models as they disembark. However, it does mean that they are destroyed on a roll of 1 or 2, whereas normally models climbing out of a destroyed transport are destroyed on a roll of 1. Now, the last 3 here are going to be some other very important ones. The first one is called Fire Overwatch, which you use when one of your units is declared as a charge target and allows them to fire Overwatch at the charger. This is a core mechanic that you don't see used particularly often. There are some faction-specific abilities that interact with Overwatch pretty consistently, but this is really the only way to unlock it if you don't have any special abilities for your army. It allows you, essentially, to shoot as if it were the shooting phase at the unit charging you. However, your attacks only hit on rolls of 6. Regardless of if you have any benefits to hit, or your opponent has any negatives, or anything else like that, only your 6s are going to hit when you're firing Overwatch. If you have weapons that automatically hit, they will still automatically hit, so that makes things like Flamers really effective when firing Overwatch. But otherwise, it gives you a last-ditch, if inconsistent, way to damage your opponent before they engage you in melee. Counter-Offensive is a 2 CP stratagem that allows you to interrupt the normal flow of combat. You can use it immediately after an enemy unit fights in the fight phase, and it allows you to then select one of your own models to fight. This doesn't mean that a unit gets to fight more than once in the fight phase. It basically just moves them up in the normal order of fight phase selection, but the most common situation in which this gets used is that if your opponent charges your army with 2 charging units, they will fight with one of their charging units first, and immediately after that unit fights, you can then use counter-offensive to fight with another one of your units that was charged this turn, interrupting the normal flow of combat where your opponent would roll all of their charging units first. This gives a lot of interactivity to the fight phase and gives both players something to do over the course of the fight phase, and it is a very important one to keep in mind. Lastly, Insane Bravery is a 2 CP stratagem that can only be used once per game, and it allows you to automatically pass a morale test on one of your units. You don't roll dice for the morale test, and you don't roll any combat attrition at all. Your unit has just assumed to have rolled a 1, which is normally an automatic pass on any morale check. Knowledge of stratagems is a very important skill in Warhammer 40k, so I encourage you to study any codex that you are planning on playing very extensively so you know which stratagems are going to be useful to you in your games. Moving on, let's talk about some more specific stuff. Let's talk about the reinforcement step of the game. Now, the reinforcement step is a subdivision of the movement phase. It occurs after all of your units have been selected to move and completed their movement activations. Some models, for example, Space Marine Jump Infantry, and models that you have placed into Strategic Reserve using command points, have the ability to be placed on the table after the battle has started, instead of being placed in your deployment zone as normal. These are things like teleporters or models being airdropped onto the table or burrowing up for underground that allow them to outflank their opponent and come in from unexpected angles. Now, during the reinforcement step of your movement phase, you will go ahead and one at a time place all of your units units that are currently reinforcements onto the table. You cannot do this on the first turn, so any reinforcement unit that you have, unless otherwise specified, only comes in on round 2. A couple models break this rule. For example, Space Marine drop pods can be placed in on the first battle round, but basically no other reinforcements can. Generally speaking, models that come in during the reinforcement step cannot be placed within 9 inches, sometimes 12 inches of enemy models, and count as having moved that turn. If they charge any enemy models, regardless of the elevation of their target, they always need a 9 to make their charge move, and they can't move further that turn unless it is to charge or make fight phase movements. Now, a lot of these models can be placed anywhere on the table, but some models that are outflanking, for example, have to be placed wholly within a distance of the table edge, and an example of this are strategic reserves. Strategic reserves is a way to enter any of the models that you want in your army into reinforcements. The cost to place units in strategic reserve is essentially the combined power rating of all of your units entering strategic reserve. Placing any units into strategic reserve costs you 1 CP. If your units are 10 power level or more, it will cost you 2. If they're 20 power level or more, it will cost you 3, and so on and so forth. When units are brought in from strategic reserve, they could be placed wholly within any table edge that is not the table edge designated as your opponent's table edge in the mission diagram. If they're arriving on turn 2, they also cannot be placed within your opponent's deployment zone, but if they're arriving on turn 3, they don't have that restriction. They just can't be placed off of your opponent's battlefield edge. If you place them within an inch of your own battlefield edge, they can also ignore the restriction where they have to be placed outside of 9 inches of enemy models. So placing them defensively does give you a little bit more flexibility. Once all of the reinforcements that you wish to place that turn have been placed, you move on to the psychic phase as normal. However, if it is battle round 3, and you still have reinforcement units that have not been placed during that reinforcement step, then they will be destroyed at the end of that battle round. In addition, if you have any additional reinforcements that haven't been brought in by the end of battle round 5, they are also destroyed. There's essentially 2 walls during the game during which any reinforcements left in reserve will be destroyed. Reinforcements are a very interesting tactical addition to Warhammer 40k in that they give your opponent the ability to counterplay them by using screening or smart play to limit the amount of attacks that your reserves can get on when they come in, while also giving you more tactical options to come in at different angles. Now, as we round out the video, I'm going to talk about some particular unit types that have special rules associated with them. I've hopped in TTS here to talk about some of the wild and wacky abilities that characters have, in addition to the normally powerful support abilities that they bring to your army. Characters have a lot of benefits over normal troops. For instance, they often have access to relic and warlord traits, which I have talked about extensively in my list building video. You can go check that out there. But they also have access to 2 abilities known as Lookout Sir and Heroic Intervention. Firstly, characters usually are individual models. There are very few multi-model character units, and as such, they need to be protected a little bit by the remainder of their army, which they are by the Lookout Sir ability. This ability makes a character untargetable by enemy attacks unless it is the closest model, visible to the enemy model attacking them, and not within 3 inches of any other friendly models. Now, that's a lot of criteria, so let's talk about exactly how that works. First off, this rule basically only applies to characters below 10 wounds. If you are 10 wounds or greater, you are essentially operated when being shot at in the shooting phase exactly like you would be any other unit type. You can be targeted as long as your opponent has line of sight to you. Full stop, that's it. And you also can potentially block for characters using the rules we're going to be talking about here. So here's how Lookout Sir works in a nutshell. As long as the character is within 3 inches of another friendly unit that has at least 3 models in it, or is a big vehicle or monster itself that is not itself a 9 or less wound character, then it gains the attribute of being Lookout Sir'd for. This is essentially the unit bodyguarding for them, blocking hits for them, or just telling them to keep their head down. As long as the unit is being looked out for, if an enemy model is choosing targets for a ranged attack, it cannot choose them to be the target if there are any other friendly models closer. So in this instance, for example, if this chaplain was standing here, while it is within 3 inches of the Land Raider, this exocrine on my side of the table could target it because no other friendly models would be closer. If the positions were swapped and the Land Raider was in front, I could not target the chaplain because there would be a Land Raider that was within 3 inches of the chaplain and closer to them. Where this gets weird, though, is that the unit closer to the attacking model than the character giving them the effect of not being the closest model, does not have to be in line of sight. So for example, you could place a tactical squad behind this wall here, where the exocrine does not have line of sight to them. And because the chaplain is within 3 inches of a vehicle, they are being protected, which means that when the exocrine goes to choose its targets, it could not choose the chaplain because the chaplain is within 3 inches of another unit that's blocking for them and not the closest unit to the attacker. It's a little strange and conceptual, but once you play a couple games with this character protection rule, it gets a lot easier to remember. Basically, just think of their untargetability aura turning on or off when they are within 3 inches of any other friendly units. And while that aura is active, they have to be the closest unit to an enemy model in order to be attacked by them. Now, the other thing that characters can do is perform what's called a heroic intervention. This allows characters to join in the fight with nearby units, even though they themselves are not inside that unit. A heroic intervention triggers at the end of your opponent's charge phase in what's called their heroic intervention step. You can never perform a heroic intervention during your own charge phase. They only trigger during your opponent's charge phase. A character is eligible to perform a heroic intervention if, at the end of that charge phase, they are within 3 inches of any enemy models. If this is the case, then during that step, you will essentially activate each of your eligible characters, and they will perform what is basically a pile-in move towards that enemy model. Typically, this doesn't require you to be brought into engagement range, so you could just use it to gain extra movement and not be brought into melee. But oftentimes, you just want to get your character within an inch of an enemy model. Now, a couple things that are important to note about this is that this does not necessarily make you eligible to fight with that unit in the fight phase. If, when it comes time for that character to fight, there are no models within an engagement range of them, they won't be able to attack, since the requirements to be able to attack are that you charged this turn, which the chaplain did not. He performed a heroic intervention, which is different than charging, or you are currently within an inch. But if, for example, this Hormigant had moved outside of an inch or had been killed, then the Terminator chaplain would not have anybody within his engagement range, and he would not be able to attack. The other downside of performing a heroic intervention is that it allows enemy units that charged this turn to attack you even if you hadn't been declared as one of their charged targets. So if this Terminator comes in here, the Hormigons could then redirect their attacks to try to take him out instead of attacking the tactical marine squad that they originally charged. So there are some significant downsides to heroically intervening, but what it does do is allow you to reposition your characters during your opponent's turn, which is very powerful, and potentially get an attack off with them if they're able to lock in within an inch of enemy models. It is important to keep in mind, however, that it doesn't count as charging and doesn't make you automatically eligible to perform your melee attacks. You will still have to be eligible when it comes around your time to fight. The other model type that I feel it's important to talk about in this video are transports. Transports are a type of unit that can embark other units into them in order to carry them around the battlefield. Now, I'll talk about some of the pre-game phases in the next video where I talk about how to resolve missions, but you can elect before the game starts to have your units embarked in any of your transports, which means when they're deployed, the unit embarked will not be deployed by itself. Instead, only the transport will be placed and the unit will be assumed to be inside it. While inside a transport, units have a lot of restrictions. They basically can't affect the battlefield in any way, and even if they have a rule like the open top drill that allows them to fire out, they aren't affected by things like, and stratagems can't be used to affect them either. So there's a lot of restrictions on units embarked in transports. For all intents and purposes, the inside of a transport is a nebulous void where your units sort of float in a meaningless nothing until such time as the doors of the transport open and they're allowed to leave. They basically can't affect the battlefield in any way. None of their abilities matter. And unless they have some specific rules or the transport itself has specific rules that allow there to be an interaction between them, those units don't affect the table. Fortunately, that also means that they can't be targeted by enemy attacks, and when the transport moves around, they'll move with it, so you can use the transport's usually faster movement to get yourself up the table under the protection of its armor. Now, if you want to get your unit out of a transport, you just have to, anytime during your movement phase before the transport is chosen to activate, declare that your unit is going to be disembarking. When you do, the unit gets placed wholly within 3 inches of the transport, so In this case, for the Land Raider, we're going to use its hull measurement to measure from any part of the model. And as long as these tactical marines that were embarked get placed wholly within 3 inches of that model, then they will be a-okay. A unit that disembarks a transport is always counted as having moved, so things like heavy weapons, if you're infantry, will always suffer -1 to hit. However, you can then act normally. You can move or advance and charge anything you want to. You can't obviously be placed within engagement range of enemy models, but you can just go ahead and continue to move on with your turn and shoot with them in the shooting phase and charge with them in the charge phase. It is important to keep in mind, however, that this has to be done before the transport moves. So essentially, a transport, if it's trying to deliver troops to an area, will have to move up to the position where it wants to deliver them, wait a turn for your opponent to do their thing, then the subsequent turn, they're going to be able to disembark those models, and those models can move up and do their own stuff. Now, if you want to get that unit back into a transport, or any unit into a transport, then when a unit completes a move, as long as each of those models in that unit end within 3 inches of a transport, they can then embark on it, in which case they move into its transport capacity and are removed from the table, just as we talked about before. The transport can then hold them in its bay for a while or disembark them immediately next turn, whatever you want to do. And it's also important to note that this can trigger off any normal move, advance, or fall back, which means if you have the ability to make any of those specific type of movements outside of your movement phase, you could potentially be moving back into the transport outside the normal time that you would be doing so. Now, unlike disembarking, which you can do from a transport that's engaged by an enemy, you cannot embark on a transport that's engaged by an enemy. So while these Marines could bail out if they don't want to be inside a Raider being pulverized by a big Tyranid monster, they can't get back in. I guess it's a little too scary for them. Now, with the unit off the table, what happens if the transport itself gets destroyed? Well, when the transport's destroyed, before it's removed from the table, all of the models that were embarked with it will immediately disembark. Any models that can't disembark anytime they're placed on the table, and they can't be placed within coherency and outside of an inch of any enemy models, they are counted as destroyed. You can use the emergency disembarkation stratagem we talked about in the stratagem section to disembark within 6 inches rather than just 3, which gives you a lot more leeway on disembarking that unit if potentially they were being engaged by any enemy models. For example, if we had the Hormigons standing here to make that disembarkation very awkward, you could use emergency disembark to sort of skirt their engagement range and place them in a legal position. It's important to note that a disembark is a placement effect. The unit doesn't literally move from where the transport was, so they are just essentially teleported to that 3 inches away from the model location, or wholly within 6 inches if you're using emergency disembark. If the unit is disembarking from a transport because it's destroyed, you're then, after all of the models are placed thanks to the disembark, gonna roll 1d6 for each model that disembarked from that transport. So in this case, if all of these Ultramarines disembarked, the Chaplain and the Tactical Marine Squad, we would end up rolling 6 dice because 6 models then disembarked. For any ones that we roll, in this case we have 2 ones, any one of those models at the choice of their controlling player is removed. So in this case, we'll remove 2 Tactical Marines because we removed 2 ones. This allows the sort of random mooks in your squad to kind of protect the characters from being removed. But one thing that's important to note is that you have to place all of the models from that disembark before you roll the dice. So for example, if you couldn't place all of the Tactical Marines in range because the Hormigons were there, and some of them ended up having to be destroyed because they were in engagement range of enemy models, you would not roll a d6 to see if those models died. You would just then roll 4d6 and remove any of the remaining ones. If you do use that emergency disembarkation stratagem, as we talked about before, your models would be removed on a 1 or a 2, not just a roll of 1. Still, disembarking from a destroyed transport and potentially being able to make that disembark behind line of sight blocking terrain or in a safer position means that while some of your models might die to the vehicle being destroyed, they're still going to be much more protected than they were just out in the open, and the Land Raiders' heavy armor is going to keep them safe as they move up the table. Now, another model that's called out in the advanced rules of 40k that I'm just going to mention very briefly here are aircraft, like the Storm Raven we have here. The first thing about aircraft that you have to keep in mind is that if a unit has the aircraft keyword, regardless of whether or not it has the flyer battlefield role, although most aircraft are flyers, not all flyers are aircraft, and vice versa. If it is aircraft, it can't control, or contest objectives. So as we move on to the next video and talk about how to actually win a game of 40K and score objective points, keep in mind that if you have an aircraft, even if it's in hover mode, which some aircraft can do, they will never interact with objectives in any way, primary objectives anyway. They can't hold objective tokens, although sometimes they do score secondary objectives. In addition, a lot of aircraft have a minimum move. So for example, as long as this Storm Raven gunship is not in hover mode, it has a minimum move of 20 inches, which means that it has to essentially end its movement outside 20 inches of wherever it started. Well, it doesn't matter so much for the Storm Raven gunship, since flyers can essentially move over any terrain that they want without penalty. If you do have aircraft that can move multiple times during their movement phase activation, then it's important to remember that you have to end 20 inches from your starting point. So, for example, if you have an aircraft with a minimum movement but no requirement to move in straight lines, you can't just move back and forth an infinite number of times before you get to your final resting place. The specific ways that aircraft interact with the minimum move rules and whether or not they even have one is listed on their datasheet, so make sure you check out your particular aircraft rules because sometimes they operate a little bit differently from each other. Now, the other thing to keep in mind about aircraft is how they interact with melee. This guy doesn't look too far off the ground, but these Hormicans can't jump that high. They can't get up there to attack it. While aircraft do have an engagement range, a lot of aircraft, specifically those with the airborne rule, cannot be fought by models that don't have the fly keyword. In addition, an aircraft model, while it usually measures to the base for movement and attacking, isn't really represented by its base because an aircraft is assumed to be way above the table flying around. Having the base impede enemy movement wouldn't really make sense. So while you can't end an engagement range of an aircraft just like you can't any other unit, you can move through its engagement range and cross its base without penalty as long as you have enough movement to entirely clear it. This means that while aircraft can potentially block the final resting place of models, like these Hormigans, for example, couldn't legally move here, they can't be used to physically body block your movement, since you can just go right through their base if you need to. In addition, whenever you're performing a fight phase movement, so a pile-in, consolidate, or even a heroic intervention, you exclude aircraft unless you fly when you're determining the closest model. So that means, for example, if we were performing a pile-in with these Hormigons, we would probably want to get into melee with this Terminator Chaplain, but this Storm Raven would normally stop us. The models would have to kind of spiral around like this so that they end their movement closer to the Storm Raven, but because of that aircraft rule, they can actually entirely ignore the Storm Raven. They can move through its base, just as we talked about, and they ignore it for the purposes of piling in, which means they can just elect to move towards the Chaplain and move in this direction. That means that while aircraft have a ton of flexibility in where they move and how they engage with their enemy, your enemy isn't necessarily as impeded by an aircraft model as they would be a normal model type. So with that, that's basically it for the more advanced rules of Warhammer 40K. Between the core rules video and this video, you have most of the information that you need to play an entire game of 40K with all of these specialized unit types. I cover some of the more specific special rules, especially pertaining to list building and how terrain works in other videos. I'll go ahead and link them up here. So if you are interested and have any questions on how those work, you can go check those videos out. And in the next video, I'm going to be talking about how to play 40K missions in the GT 2021 format. Stay tuned for that video. Remember to drop a like and a comment down below if you enjoy this series of new player tutorials. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.